Chapters 1 to 4 of Movement of Animals by Aristotle, translated by A. S. L. Farquharson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 1. Elsewhere, we have investigated in detail the movement of animals after their various kinds, the differences between them, and the reasons for their particular characters. For some animals fly, some swim, some walk, others move in various other ways. There remains an investigation of the common ground of any sort of animal movement whatsoever. Now, we have already determined, when we were discussing whether eternal motion exists or not, and its definition, if it does exist, that the origin of all other motions is that which moves itself, and that the origin of this is the immovable, and that the prime mover must of necessity be immovable. And we must grasp this not only generally in theory, but also by reference to individuals in the world of sense. For with these in view, we seek general theories, and with these we believe that general theories ought to harmonize. Now, in the world of sense, too, it is plainly impossible for movement to be initiated if there is nothing at rest, and before all else, in our present subject, animal life. For if one of the parts of an animal be moved, another must be at rest, and this is the purpose of their joints. Animals use joints like a centre, and the whole member in which the joint is becomes both one and two, both straight and bent, changing potentially and actually by reason of the joint. And when it is bending and being moved, one of the points in the joint is moved, and one is at rest, just as if the points A and D of a diameter were at rest, and B were moved, and DAC were generated. However, in the geometrical illustration, the centre is held to be altogether indivisible. For in mathematics, motion is a fiction, as the phrase goes, no mathematical entity being really moved. Whereas, in the case of joints, the centres become now one potentially and divided actually, and now one actually and divided potentially. But still, the origin of movement, qua origin, always remains at rest when the lower part of a limb is moved. For example, the elbow joint when the forearm is moved, and the shoulder when the whole arm, the knee when the tibia is moved, and the hip when the whole leg. Accordingly, it is plain that each animal as a whole must have within itself a point at rest, whence will be the origin of that which is moved, and supporting itself upon which it will be moved both as a complete whole and in its members. 2. But the point of rest in the animal is still quite ineffectual, unless there be something without which is absolutely at rest and immovable. Now it is worth while to pause and consider what has been said, for it involves a speculation which extends beyond animals, even to the motion and march of the universe. For just as there must be something immovable within the animal, if it is to be moved, so even more must there be without it something immovable, by supporting itself upon which that which is moved moves. For were that something always to give way, as it does for mice walking in grain, or persons walking in sand, advance would be impossible, and neither would there be any walking unless the ground were to remain still, nor any flying or swimming were not the air and the sea to resist. And this which resists must needs be different from what is moved, the whole of it from the whole of that, and what is thus immovable must be no part of what is moved, Otherwise, there will be no movement. Evidence of this lies in the problem why it is that a man easily moves a boat from outside if he push with a pole, putting it against the mast or some other part. But if he tried to do this when in the boat itself, he would never move it. No, not giant Tityus himself, nor Boreas blowing from inside the ship, if he really were blowing in the way painters represent him, for they paint him sending the breath out from the boat. For whether one blew gently, or so stoutly as to make a very great wind, and whether what were thrown or pushed were wind or something else, it is necessary in the first place to be supported upon one of one's own members which is at rest, and so to push, and in the second place for this member either itself or that of which it is a part to remain at rest, fixing itself against something external to itself. Now, the man who is himself in the boat, if he pushes, fixing himself against the boat, very naturally does not move the boat, because what he pushes against should properly remain at rest. Now, what he is trying to move, and what he is fixing himself against, is in his case the same. If, however, he pushes or pulls from outside, he does move it, for the ground is no part of the boat. 3. Here we may ask the difficult question, whether, if something moves the whole heavens, this mover must be immovable, and moreover be no part of the heavens, nor in the heavens. For either it is moved itself and moves the heavens, in which case it must touch something immovable in order to create movement, and then this is no part of that which creates movement. Or if the mover is from the first immovable, it will equally be no part of that which is moved. In this point at least they argue correctly who say that as the sphere is carried round in a circle, no single part remains still, for then either the whole would necessarily stand still, or its continuity be torn asunder. But they argue less well in supposing that the poles have a certain force, though conceived as having no magnitude, but as merely termini or points. For besides the fact that no such things have any substantial existence, it is impossible for a single movement to be initiated by what is twofold, and yet they make the poles two. From a review of these difficulties we may conclude that there is something so related to the whole of nature, as the earth is to animals, and things moved by them. And the mythologists, with their fable of Atlas setting his feet upon the earth, appear to have based the fable upon intelligent grounds. They make Atlas a kind of diameter, twirling the heavens about the poles. Now, as the earth remains still, this would be reasonable enough, but their theory involves them in the position that the earth is no part of the universe. And further, the force of that which initiates movement must be made equal to the force of that which remains at rest. For there is a definite quantity of force or power by dint of which that which remains at rest does so, just as there is of force by dint of which that which initiates movement does so, and as there is a necessary proportion between opposite motions, so there is between absences of motion. Now, equal forces are unaffected by one another, but are overcome by a superiority of force. And so, in their theory, Atlas, or whatever similar power initiates movement from within, must exert no more force than will exactly balance the stability of the earth. Otherwise, the earth will be moved out of her place in the center of things. For as the pusher pushes, so is the pushed pushed, and with equal force. But the prime mover moves that which is to begin with at rest, so that the power it exerts is greater rather than equal, and like to the power which produces absence of motion in that which is moved. And similarly also the power of what is moved, and so moves, must be greater than the power of that which is moved but does not initiate movement. Therefore the force of the earth in its immobility will have to be as great as the force of the whole heavens, and of that which moves the heavens. But if that is impossible, it follows that the heavens cannot possibly be moved by any force of this kind inside them. 4. There is a further difficulty about the motions of the parts of the heavens, which, as akin to what has gone before, may be considered next. For if one could overcome by force of motion the immobility of the earth, he would clearly move it away from the centre. And it is plain that the power from which this force would originate will not be infinite, for the earth is not infinite, and therefore its weight is not. Now there are more senses than one of the word impossible. When we say it is impossible to see a sound, and when we say it is impossible to see the men in the moon, we use two senses of the word. The former is of necessity; the latter, though their nature is to be seen, cannot as a fact be seen by us. Now we suppose that the heavens are of necessity impossible to destroy and to dissolve, whereas the result of the present argument would be to do away with this necessity. For it is natural and possible for a motion to exist greater than the force by dint of which the earth is at rest, or than that by dint of which fire and ether are moved. If, then, there are superior motions, these will be dissolved in succession by one another; and if there actually are not, but might possibly be, for the earth cannot be infinite, because no body can possibly be infinite, there is a possibility of the heavens being dissolved. For what is to prevent this coming to pass unless it be impossible? And it is not impossible unless the opposite is necessary. This difficulty, however, we will discuss elsewhere. To resume, must there be something immovable and at rest outside of what is moved, and no part of it, or not? And must this necessarily be so also in the case of the universe? Perhaps it would be thought strange were the origin of movement inside, and to those who so conceive it, the word of Homer would appear to have been well spoken. Quote, "Nay, ye would not pull Zeus, highest of all, from heaven to the plain; no, not even if ye toiled right hard. Come all ye gods and goddesses, set hands to the chain." For that which is entirely immovable cannot possibly be moved by anything. And herein lies the solution of the difficulty stated some time back: the possibility or impossibility of dissolving the system of the heavens, in that it depends from an original which is immovable. Now in the animal world there must be not only an immovable without, but also within, those things which move in place and initiate their own movement. For one part of an animal must be moved, and another be at rest, and against this the part which is moved will support itself and be moved. For example, if it move one of its parts, for one part, as it were, supports itself against another part at rest. But about things without life which are moved, one might ask the question whether all contain in themselves both that which is at rest and that which initiates movement, and whether they also, for instance, fire, earth, or any other inanimate thing, must support themselves against something outside which is at rest; or is this impossible, and must it not be looked for, rather, in those primary causes by which they are set in motion? For all things without life are moved by something other, and the origin of all things so moved are things which move themselves. And out of these we have spoken about animals, for they must all have in themselves that which is at rest, and without them that against which they are supported. But whether there is some higher and prime mover is not clear, and an origin of that kind involves a different discussion. Animals, at any rate, which move themselves, are all moved supporting themselves on what is outside them, even when they inspire and expire. For there is no essential difference between casting a great and a small weight. And this is what men do when they spit and cough, and when they breathe in and breathe out. End of chapter 4. Chapters 5 to 8 of Movement of Animals by Aristotle, translated by A.S.L. Farquharson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 5. But is it only in that which moves itself in place that there must be a point at rest, or does this hold also of that which causes its own qualitative changes and its own growth? Now, the question of original generation and decay is different. For if there is, as we hold, a primary movement, this would be the cause of generation and decay, and probably of all the secondary movements too. And as in the universe, so in the animal world, this is the primary movement when the creature attains maturity. And therefore it is the cause of growth, when the creature becomes the cause of its own growth, and the cause too of alteration. But if this is not the primary movement, then the point at rest is not necessary. However, the earliest growth and alteration in the living creature arise through another and by other channels. Nor can anything possibly be the cause of its own generation and decay. For the mover must exist before the moved, the begetter before the begotten, and nothing is prior to itself. 6. Now, whether the soul is moved or not, and how it is moved, if it be moved, has been stated before in our treatise concerning it. And since all inorganic things are moved by some other thing, and the manner of the movement of the first and eternally moved, and how the first mover moves it, has been determined before in our metaphysics, it remains to inquire how the soul moves the body, and what is the origin of movement in a living creature. For if we accept the movement of the universe, things with life are the causes of the movement of all else, that is, of all that are not moved by one another by mutual impact. And so all their motions have a term or limit, inasmuch as the movements of things with life have such. For all living things both move and are moved with some object, so that this is the term of all their movement, the end that is in view. Now we see that the living creature is moved by intellect, imagination, purpose, wish, and appetite, and all these are reducible to mind and desire. For both imagination and sensation are on common ground with mind, since all three are faculties of judgment, though differing according to distinctions stated elsewhere. Will, however, impulse, and appetite are all three forms of desire, while purpose belongs both to intellect and to desire. Therefore, the object of desire or of intellect first initiates movement, not, that is, every object of intellect, only the end in the domain of conduct. Accordingly, among goods, That which moves is a practical end, not the good in its whole extent. For it initiates movement only so far as something else is for its sake, or so far as it is the object of that which is for the sake of something else. And we must suppose that a seeming good may take the room of actual good, and so may the pleasant, which is itself a seeming good. From these considerations it is clear that in one regard that which is eternally moved by the eternal mover is moved in the same way as every living creature, in another regard differently. And so, while it is moved eternally, the movement of living creatures has a term. Now, the eternal, beautiful, and the truly and primarily good, which is not at one time good, at another time not good, is too divine and precious to be relative to anything else. The prime mover, then, moves, itself being unmoved, whereas desire and its faculty are moved and so move. But it is not necessary for the last in the chain of things moved to move something else. Wherefore it is plainly reasonable that motion in place should be the last of what happens in the region of things happening, since the living creature is moved and goes forward by reason of desire or purpose, when some alteration has been set going on the occasion of sensation or imagination. 7. But how is it that thought, viz. Sense, imagination, and thought proper, is sometimes followed by action, sometimes not, sometimes by movement, sometimes not? What happens seems parallel to the case of thinking and inferring about the immovable objects of science. There the end is the truth seen. For when one conceives the two premises, one at once conceives and comprehends the conclusion. But here the two premises result in a conclusion, which is an action. For example, one conceives that every man ought to walk. One is a man oneself. Straightway one walks. Or that in this case no man should walk. One is a man. Straightway one remains at rest. And one so acts in the two cases, provided that there is nothing in the one case to compel, or in the other to prevent. Again, I ought to create a good. A house is good. Straightway I make a house. I need a covering. A coat is a covering. I need a coat. What I need, I ought to make. I need a coat. I make a coat. And the conclusion, I must make a coat, is an action. And the action goes back to the beginning or first step. If there is to be a coat, one must first have B, and if B, then A. So one gets A to begin with. Now that the action is the conclusion is clear, but the premises of action are of two kinds, of the good and of the possible. And as in some cases of speculative inquiry we suppress one premise, so here the mind does not stop to consider at all an obvious minor premise. For example, if walking is good for man, one does not dwell upon the minor "I am a man." And so, what we do without reflection, we do quickly. For when a man actualizes himself in relation to his object, either by perceiving or imagining or conceiving it, what he desires he does at once. For the actualizing of desire is a substitute for inquiry or reflection. I want to drink, says appetite. This is drink, says sense or imagination or mind. Straightway I drink. In this way, living creatures are impelled to move and to act. And desire is the last or immediate cause of movement. And desire arises after perception, or after imagination and conception. And things that desire to act now create, and now act under the influence of appetite or impulse, or of desire or wish. The movements of animals may be compared with those of automatic puppets, which are set going on the occasion of a tiny movement. The levers are released and strike the twisted strings against one another. Or with the toy wagon, for the child mounts on it and moves it straight forward, and then again it is moved in a circle owing to its wheels being of unequal diameter. The smaller acts like a center on the same principle as the cylinders. Animals have parts of a similar kind. Their organs, the sinewy tendons, to wit, and the bones. The bones are like the wooden levers in the automaton, and the iron. The tendons are like the strings, for when these are tightened or released, movement begins. However, in the automata and the toy wagon there is no change of quality, though if the inner wheels became smaller and greater by turns, there would be the same circular movement set up. In an animal, the same part has the power of becoming now larger and now smaller, and changing its form, as the parts increase by warmth, and again contract by cold and change their quality. This change of quality is caused by imaginations and sensations and by ideas. Sensations are obviously a form of change of quality, and imagination and conception have the same effect as the objects so imagined and conceived. For, in a measure, the form conceived, be it of hot or cold or pleasant or fearful, is like what the actual objects would be, and so we shudder and are frightened at a mere idea. Now, all these affections involve changes of quality, and with those changes some parts of the body enlarge, others grow smaller. And it is not hard to see that a small change occurring at the center makes great and numerous changes at the circumference, just as by shifting the rudder a hair's breadth you get a wide deviation at the prow. And further, when by reason of heat or cold or some kindred affection a change is set up in the region of the heart, even in an imperceptibly small part of the heart, it produces a vast difference in the periphery of the body. Blushing, let us say, or turning white, goose-skin and shivers, and their opposites. 8. But to return, the object we pursue or avoid in the field of action is, as has been explained, the original of movement, and upon the conception and imagination of this, there necessarily follows a change in the temperature of the body. For what is painful we avoid, what is pleasing we pursue. We are, however, unconscious of what happens in the minute parts. Still, anything painful or pleasing is generally speaking accompanied by a definite change of temperature in the body. One may see this by considering the affections: blind courage and panic fears, erotic motions, and the rest of the corporeal affections, pleasant and painful, are all accompanied by a change of temperature, some in a particular member, others in the body generally. So memories and anticipations, using as it were the reflected images of these pleasures and pains, are now more and now less causes of the same changes of temperature. And so we see the reason of nature's handiwork in the inward parts, and in the centres of movement of the organic members. They change from solid to moist, and from moist to solid, from soft to hard, and vice versa. And so, when these are affected in this way, and when besides the passive and active have the constitution we have many times described, as often as it comes to pass that one is active and the other passive, and neither of them falls short of the elements of its essence, straightway one acts and the other responds. And on this account, thinking that one ought to go and going are virtually simultaneous, unless there be something else to hinder action. The organic parts are suitably prepared by the affections, these again by desire, and desire by imagination. Imagination in its turn depends either upon conception or sense perception, and the simultaneity and speed are due to the natural correspondence of the active and passive. However, that which first moves the animal organism must be situate in a definite original. Now, we have said that a joint is the beginning of one part of a limb, the end of another, and so nature employs it sometimes as one, sometimes as two. When movement arises from a joint, one of the extreme points must remain at rest, and the other be moved. For, as we explained above, the mover must support itself against a point at rest. Accordingly, in the case of the elbow joint, the last point of the forearm is moved, but does not move anything, while in the flexion, one point of the elbow, which lies in the whole forearm, that is being moved, is moved. But there must also be a point which is unmoved, and this is our meaning when we speak of a point which is in potency one, but which becomes two in actual exercise. Now, if the arm were the living animal, somewhere in its elbow joint would be situate the original seat of the moving soul. Since, however, it is possible for a lifeless thing to be so related to the hand as the forearm is to the upper, for example, when a man moves a stick in his hand, it is evident that the soul, the original of movement, could not lie in either of the two extreme points, neither, that is, in the last point of the stick which is moved, nor in the original point which causes movement. For the stick too has an end point and an originative point by reference to the hand. Accordingly, this example shows that the moving original which derives from the soul is not in the stick, and if not, then not in the hand. For a precisely similar relation obtains between the hand and the wrist, as between the wrist and the elbow. In this matter, it makes no difference whether the part is a continuous part of the body or not. The stick may be looked at as a detached part of the whole. It follows then of necessity that the original cannot lie in any individual origin, which is the end of another member, even though there may lie another part outside the one in question. For example, relatively to the end point of the stick, the hand is the original, but the original of the hand's movement is in the wrist. And so, if the true original is not in the hand, because there is still something higher up, neither is the true original in the wrist. For once more, if the elbow is at rest, the whole part below it can be moved as a continuous whole. End of chapter 8. Chapters 9 to 11 of Movement of Animals by Aristotle, translated by A.S.L. Farquharson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 9. Now, since the left and the right sides are symmetrical, and these opposites are moved simultaneously, it cannot be that the left is moved by the right, remaining stationary, nor vice versa. The original must always be in what lies above both. Therefore, the original seat of the moving soul must be in that which lies in the middle. For of both extremes, the middle is the limiting point. And this is similarly related to the movements from above and below. Those, that is, from the head, and to the bones, which spring from the spinal column in creatures that have a spinal column. And this is a reasonable arrangement, for the sensorium is in our opinion in the center too. And so, if the region of the original of movement is altered in structure through sense perception, and thus changes, it carries with it the parts that depend upon it, and they too are extended or contracted, and in this way the movement of the creature necessarily follows. And the middle of the body must needs be in potency one, but in action more than one. For the limbs are moved simultaneously from the original seat of movement, and when one is at rest, the other is moved. For example, in the line BAC, B is moved, and A is the mover. There must, however, be a point at rest if one is to move and the other to be moved. A, then, being one in potency, must be two in action, and so be a definite spatial magnitude, not a mathematical point. Again, C may be moved simultaneously with B. Both the originals, then, in A must move and be moved, and so there must be something other than them which moves but is not moved. For otherwise, when the movement begins, the extremes, i.e. the originals, in A would rest upon one another, like two men putting themselves back to back, and so moving their legs. There must then be some one thing which moves both. This something is the soul, distinct from the spatial magnitude just described, and yet located therein. 10. Although, from the point of view of the definition of movement, a definition which gives the cause, desire, is the middle term or cause, and desire moves being moved. Still, in the material animated body, there must be some material which itself moves being moved. Now, that which is moved, but whose nature is not to initiate movement, is capable of being passive to an external force, while that which initiates movement must needs possess a kind of force and power. Now, experience shows us that animals do both possess connatural spirit, and derive power from this. How this connatural spirit is maintained in the body is explained in other passages of our works. And this spirit appears to stand to the soul centre or original in a relation analogous to that between the point in a joint which moves being moved and the unmoved. Now, since this centre is for some animals in the heart, in the rest in a part analogous with the heart, we further see the reason for the connatural spirit being situate where it actually is found. The question whether the spirit remains always the same or constantly changes and is renewed, like the cognate question about the rest of the parts of the body, is better postponed. At all events, we see that it is well disposed to excite movement and to exert power, and the functions of movement are thrusting and pulling. Accordingly, the organ of movement must be capable of expanding and contracting, and this is precisely the characteristic of spirit. It contracts and expands naturally, and so is able to pull and to thrust from one and the same cause, exhibiting gravity compared with the fiery element, and levity by comparison with the opposites of fire. Now, that which is to initiate movement, without change of structure, must be of the kind described. For the elementary bodies prevail over one another in a compound body by dint of disproportion. The light is overcome and kept down by the heavier, and the heavy kept up by the lighter. We have now explained what the part is which is moved when the soul originates movement in the body, and what is the reason for this. And the animal organism must be conceived after the similitude of a well-governed commonwealth. When order is once established in it, there is no more need of a separate monarch to preside over each several task. The individuals, each, play their assigned part, as it is ordered, and one thing follows another in its accustomed order. So in animals there is the same orderliness, nature taking the place of custom, and each part naturally doing his own work as nature has composed them. There is no need, then, of a soul in each part, but she resides in a kind of central governing place of the body, and the remaining parts live by continuity of natural structure, and play the parts nature would have them play. 11. So much then for the voluntary movements of animal bodies and the reasons for them. These bodies, however, display in certain members involuntary movements too, but most often non-voluntary movements. By involuntary I mean motions of the heart and of the privy member, for often upon an image arising, and without express mandate of the reason, these parts are moved. By non-voluntary I mean sleep and waking and respiration and other similar organic movements. For neither imagination nor desire is properly mistress of any of these. But since the animal body must undergo natural changes of quality, and when the parts are so altered, some must increase and others decrease, the body must straightway be moved and change with the changes that nature makes dependent upon one another. Now, the causes of the movements are natural changes of temperature, both those coming from outside the body and those taking place within it. So the involuntary movements, which occur in spite of reason in the aforesaid parts, occur when a change of quality supervenes. For conception and imagination, as we said above, produce the conditions necessary to affections, since they bring to bear the images or forms which tend to create these states. And the two parts aforesaid display this motion more conspicuously than the rest, because each is in a sense a separate vital organism, the reason being that each contains vital moisture. In the case of the heart, the cause is plain, for the heart is the seat of the senses, while an indication that the generative organ too is vital is that there flows from it the seminal potency, itself a kind of organism. Again, it is a reasonable arrangement that the movements arise in the centre upon movements in the parts, and in the parts upon movements in the centre, and so reach one another. Conceive A to be the centre or starting point. The movements then arrive at the centre from each letter in the diagram we have drawn, and flow back again from the centre, which is moved and changes, for the centre is potentially multiple. The movement of B goes to B, that of C to C, the movement of both to both. But from B to C, the movements flow by dint of going from B to A, as to a centre, and then from A to C, as from a centre. Moreover, a movement contrary to reason sometimes does, and sometimes does not arise in the organs on the occasion of the same thoughts. The reason is that sometimes the matter which is passive to the impressions is there in sufficient quantity, and of the right quality, and sometimes not. And so we have finished our account of the reasons for the parts of each kind of animal, of the soul, and further of sense perception, of sleep, of memory, and of movement in general. It remains to speak of animal generation. End of chapter 11, and end of movement of animals. Chapters 1 to 5 of Progression of Animals by Aristotle. Translated by A.S.L. Farquharson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 1. We have now to consider the parts which are useful to animals for movement in place, locomotion. First, why each part is such as it is, and to what end they possess them. And second, the differences between these parts, both in one and the same creature, and again by comparison of the parts of creatures of different species with one another. First, then, let us lay down how many questions we have to consider. The first is, what are the fewest points of motion necessary to animal progression? The second, why sanguineous animals have 4 points and not more, but bloodless animals more than 4, and generally why some animals are footless, others bipeds, others quadrupeds, others polypods, and why all have an even number of feet, if they have feet at all. Why, in fine, the points on which progression depends are even in number. Next, why are man and bird bipeds, but fish footless? And why do man and bird, though both bipeds, have an opposite curvature of the legs? For man bends his legs convexly, a bird has his bent concavely. Again, man bends his arms and legs in opposite directions, for he has his arms bent convexly, but his legs concavely. And a viviparous quadruped bends his limbs in opposite directions to a man's, and in opposite directions to one another, for he has his forelegs bent convexly, his hind legs concavely. Again, quadrupeds, which are not viviparous but oviparous, have a peculiar curvature of the limbs laterally, away from the body. Again, why do quadrupeds move their legs criss-cross? We have to examine the reasons for all these facts, and others cognate to them. That the facts are such is clear from our natural history. We have now to ask reasons for the facts. 2. At the beginning of the inquiry, we must postulate the principles we are accustomed constantly to use for our scientific investigation of nature. That is, we must take for granted principles of this universal character which appear in all nature's work. Of these, one is that nature creates nothing without a purpose, but always the best possible in each kind of living creature by reference to its essential constitution. Accordingly, if one way is better than another, that is the way of nature. Next, we must take for granted the different species of dimensions which inhere in various things. Of these, there are 3 pairs of 2 each: superior and inferior, before and behind, to the right and to the left. Further, we must assume that the originals of movements in place are thrusts and pulls. These are the essential place movements. It is only accidentally that what is carried by another is moved. It is not thought to move itself, but to be moved by something else. 3. After these preliminaries, we go on to the next questions in order. Now, of animals which change their position, some move with the whole body at once, for example, jumping animals. Others move one part first and then the other, for example, walking and running animals. In both these changes, the moving creature always changes its position by pressing against what lies below it. Accordingly, if what is below gives way too quickly for that which is moving upon it to lean against it, or if it affords no resistance at all to what is moving, the latter can of itself effect no movement upon it. For an animal which jumps makes its jump both by leaning against its own upper part, and also against what is beneath its feet. For at the joints the parts do in a sense lean upon one another, and in general, that which pushes down leans upon what is pushed down. That is why athletes jump further with weights in their hands than without, and runners run faster if they swing their arms. There is in extending the arms a kind of leaning against the hands and wrists. In all cases, then, That which moves makes its change of position by the use of at least two parts of the body. One part, so to speak, squeezes, the other is squeezed. For the part that is still is squeezed, as it has to carry the weight. The part that is lifted strains against that which carries the weight. It follows then that nothing without parts can move itself in this way, for it has not in it the distinction of the part which is passive and that which is active. 4. Again, the boundaries by which living beings are naturally determined are 6 in number: superior and inferior, before and behind, right and left. Of these, all living beings have a superior and an inferior part. For superior and inferior is in plants too, not only in animals. And this distinction is one of function, not merely of position relatively to our earth and the sky above our heads. The superior is that from which flows in each kind the distribution of nutriment and the process of growth. The inferior is that to which the process flows and in which it ends. One is a starting point, the other an end, and the starting point is the superior. And yet it might be thought that in the case of plants, at least, the inferior is rather the appropriate starting point, for in them the superior and inferior are in position other than in animals. Still, they are similarly situated from the point of view of function, though not in their position relatively to the universe. The roots are the superior part of a plant, for from them the nutriment is distributed to the growing members, and a plant takes it with its roots, as an animal does with its mouth. Things that are not only alive, but are animals, have both a front and a back, because they all have sense, and front and back are distinguished by reference to sense. The front is the part in which sense is innate, and whence each thing gets its sensations. The opposite parts are the back. All animals which partake not only in sense, but are able of themselves to make a change of place, have a further distinction of left and right, besides those already enumerated. Like the former, these are distinctions of function and not of position. The right is that from which change of position naturally begins. The opposite, which naturally depends upon this, is the left. This distinction of right and left is more articulate and detailed in some than in others. For animals which make the aforesaid change of place by the help of organized parts, I mean feet for example, or wings, or similar organs, have the left and right distinguished in greater detail, while those which are not differentiated into such parts, but make the differentiation in the body itself, and so progress, like some footless animals, for example, snakes and caterpillars after their kind, and besides, what men call earthworms. All these have the distinction spoken of, although it is not made so manifest to us. That the beginning of movement is on the right is indicated by the fact that all men carry burdens on the left shoulder. In this way, they set free the side which initiates movement, and enable the side which bears the weight to be moved. And so men hop easier on the left leg, for the nature of the right is to initiate movement, that of the left to be moved. The burden then must rest on the side which is to be moved, not on that which is going to cause movement. And if it be set on the moving side, which is the original of movement, it will either not be moved at all, or with more labor. Another indication that the right is the source of movement is the way we put our feet forward. All men lead off with the left, and after standing still, prefer to put the left foot forward, unless something happens to prevent it. The reason is that their movement comes from the leg they step off, not from the one put forward. Again, Men guard themselves with their right, and this is the reason why the right is the same in all. For that from which motion begins is the same for all, and has its natural position in the same place, and for this reason the spiral-shaped testaceans have their shells on the right, for they do not move in the direction of the spire, but all go forward in the direction opposite to the spire. Examples are the murex and the syrinx. As all animals then start movement from the right, and the right moves in the same direction as the whole, it is necessary for all to be alike right-handed. And man has the left limbs detached more than any other animal, because he is natural in a higher degree than the other animals. Now the right is naturally both better than the left and separate from it, and so in man the right is more especially the right, more dexterous, that is, than in other animals. The right then being differentiated, it is only reasonable that in man the left should be most movable and most detached. In man too, the other starting points are found most naturally and clearly distinct, the superior part, that is, and the front. 5. Animals which, like men and birds, have the superior part distinguished from the front are two-footed, biped. In them, of the 4 points of motion, 2 are wings in the one, hands and arms in the other. Animals which have the superior and the front parts identically situated are four-footed, many-footed or footless, quadruped, polypod, limbless. I use the term foot for a member employed for movement in place connected with a point on the ground, for the feet appear to have got their name from the ground under our feet. Some animals, too, have the front and back parts identically situated, for example, cephalopods, mollusks, and spiral-shaped testaceans, and these we have discussed elsewhere in another connection. Now there is in place a superior, an intermediate, and an inferior. In respect to place, bipeds have their superior part corresponding to the superior part of the universe, quadrupeds, polypods, and footless animals to the intermediate part, and plants to the inferior. The reason is that these have no power of locomotion, and the superior part is determined relatively to the nutriment, and their nutriment is from the earth. Quadrupeds, polypods, and footless animals again have their superior part corresponding to the intermediate, because they are not erect. Bipeds have theirs corresponding to the superior part of the universe, because they are erect, and of bipeds, man par excellence, for man is the most natural of bipeds. And it is reasonable for the starting points to be in these parts, for the starting point is honorable, and the superior is more honorable than the inferior, the front than the back, and the right than the left. Or we may reverse the argument and say quite well that these parts are more honorable than their opposites, just because the starting points are in them. End of chapter 5. Chapters 6 to 9 of Progression of Animals by Aristotle. Translated by A.S.L. Farquharson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 6. The above discussion has made it clear that the original of movement is in the parts on the right. Now, every continuous whole, one part of which is moved while the other remains at rest, must, in order to be able to move as a whole while one part stands still, have, in the place where both parts have opposed movements, some common part which connects the moving parts with one another. Further, in this common part, the original of the motion, and similarly of the absence of motion, of each of the parts must lie. Clearly then, if any of the opposite pairs of parts, right and left, that is, superior and inferior, before and behind, have a movement of their own, each of them has for common original of its movements the juncture of the parts in question. Now, before and behind are not distinctions relatively to that which sets up its own motion, because in nature nothing has a movement backwards, nor has a moving animal any division whereby it may make a change of position towards its front or back, but right and left, superior and inferior, are so distinguished. Accordingly, all animals which progress by the use of distinct members have these members distinguished, not by the differences of before and behind, but only of the remaining two pairs, the prior difference dividing these members into right and left, a difference which must appear as soon as you have division into two, and the other difference appearing of necessity where there is division into four. Since then these two pairs, the superior and inferior, and the right and left, are linked to one another by the same common original, by which I mean that which controls their movement, and further, everything which is intended to make a movement in each such part properly must have the original cause of all the said movements arranged in a certain definite position relatively to the distances from it of the originals of the movements of the individual members, and the centres of the individual parts are in pairs arranged coordinately or diagonally, and the common centre is the original from which the animal's movements of right and left, and similarly of superior and inferior start. Each animal must have this original at a point where it is equally or nearly equally related to each of the centres in the four parts described. 7. It is clear then how locomotion belongs to those animals only which make their changes of place by means of two or four points in their structure, or to such animals par excellence. Moreover, since this property belongs almost peculiarly to sanguineous animals, we see that no sanguineous animal can progress at more points than four, and that if it is the nature of anything so to progress at 4 points, it must of necessity be sanguineous. What we observe in the animal world is in agreement with the above account. For no sanguineous animal, if it be divided into more parts, can live for any appreciable length of time, nor can it enjoy the power of locomotion which it possessed while it was a continuous and undivided whole. But some bloodless animals and polypods can live a long time if divided in each of the severed parts, and can move in the same way as before they were dismembered. Examples are what is termed the centipede and other insects that are long in shape. For even the hinder portion of all these goes on progressing in the same direction as before, when they are cut in two. The explanation of their living when thus divided is that each of them is constructed like a continuous body of many separate living beings. It is plain, too, from what was said above, why they are like this. Animals constructed most naturally are made to move at 2 or 4 points, and even limbless sanguinea are no exception. They, too, move by dint of 4 points, whereby they achieve progression. They go forward by means of 2 flexions, for in each of their flexions there is a right and a left, both before and behind in their flat surface. In the part towards the head, a right and a left front point, and in the part towards the tail, the 2 hinder points. They look as if they moved at 2 points only, where they touch before and behind, but that is only because they are narrow in breadth. Even in them the right is the sovereign part, and there is an alternate correspondence behind, exactly as in quadrupeds. The reason of their flexions is their great length, for just as tall men walk with their spines bellied, undulated forward, and when their right shoulder is leading in a forward direction, their left hip is rather inclined backwards, so that their middle becomes hollow and bellied, undulated, so we ought to conceive snakes as moving in concave curves, undulations, upon the ground. And this is evidence that they move themselves like the quadrupeds, for they make the concave in its turn convex, and the convex concave. When in its turn the left of the forward parts is leading, the concavity is in its turn reversed, for the right becomes the inner. Let the right front point be A, the left B, the right hind C, the left D. Among land animals, this is the character of the movement of snakes, and among water animals of eels and conger eels, and also lampreys, in fact, of all that have their form snake-like. However, some marine animals of this shape have no fin, lampreys for example, but put the sea to the same use as snakes do both land and water, for snakes swim precisely as they move on the ground. Others have 2 fins only, for example, conger eels, and a kind of Cestrius, which breeds in the lake of Siphae. On this account, too, those that are accustomed to live on land, for example all the eels, move with fewer flexions in a fluid than on land, while the kind of Cestrius, which has 2 fins, by its flexion in a fluid makes up the remaining points. 8. The reason why snakes are limbless is first that nature makes nothing without purpose, but always regards what is the best possible for each individual, preserving the peculiar essence of each and its intended character. And secondly, the principle we laid down above, that no sanguineous creature can move itself at more than 4 points. Granting this, it is evident that sanguineous animals, like snakes, whose length is out of proportion to the rest of their dimensions, cannot possibly have limbs, for they cannot have more than 4, or they would be bloodless, and if they had 2 or 4, they would be practically stationary. So slow and unprofitable would their movement necessarily be. But every limbed animal has necessarily an even number of such limbs, for those which only jump and so move from place to place do not need limbs, for this movement at least, but those which not only jump but also need to walk, finding that movement not sufficient for their purposes, evidently neither are better able to progress with even limbs, or cannot otherwise progress at all. For every animal which has limbs must have an even number. For as this kind of movement is effected by part of the body at a time, and not by the whole at once, as in the movement of leaping, some of the limbs must in turn remain at rest, and others be moved, and the animal must act in each of these cases with opposite limbs, shifting the weight from the limbs that are being moved to those at rest. And so nothing can walk on 3 limbs or on 1. In the latter case it has no support at all on which to rest the body's weight. In the former, only in respect of 1 pair of opposites, and so it must necessarily fall in endeavouring so to move. Polypods, however, like the centipede, can indeed make progress on an odd number of limbs, as may be seen by the experiment of wounding one of their limbs. For then the mutilation of one row of limbs is corrected by the number of limbs which remain on either side. Such mutilated creatures, however, drag the wounded limb after them with the remainder, and do not, properly speaking, walk. Moreover, it is plain that they too would make the change of place better if they had an even number. In fact, if none were missing, and they had the limbs which correspond to one another. In this way they could equalize their own weight, and not oscillate to one side, if they had corresponding supports, instead of one section of the opposite sides being unoccupied by a limb. A walking creature advances from each of its members alternately, for in this way it recovers the same figure that it had at first. 9. The fact that all animals have an even number of feet, and the reasons for the fact have been set forth. What follows will explain that if there were no point at rest, flexion and straightening would be impossible. Flexion is a change from a right line to an arc or an angle, straightening a change from either of these to a right line. Now, in all such changes, the flexion or the straightening must be relative to one point. Moreover, without flexion, there could not be walking or swimming or flying. For since limbed creatures stand and take their weight alternately on one or other of the opposite legs, if one be thrust forward, the other must of necessity be bent. For the opposite limbs are naturally of equal length, and the one which is under the weight must be a kind of perpendicular at right angles to the ground. When then one leg is advanced, it becomes the hypotenuse of a right-angled triangle. Its square then is equal to the square on the other side, together with the square on the base. As the legs then are equal, the one at rest must bend either at the knee, or, if there were any kneeless animal which walked, at some other articulation. The following experiment exhibits the fact. If a man were to walk parallel to a wall in sunshine, the line described by the shadow of his head would not be straight, but zigzag, becoming lower as he bends, and higher when he stands, and lifts himself up. It is indeed possible to move oneself even if the leg be not bent, in the way in which children crawl. This was the old, though erroneous account of the movement of elephants. But these kinds of movements involve a flexion in the shoulders or in the hips. Nothing, at any rate, could walk upright, continuously and securely without flexions at the knee, but would have to move like men in the wrestling schools, who crawl forward through the sand on their knees. For the upper part of the upright creature is long, so that its leg has to be correspondingly long. In consequence, there must be flexion. For since a stationary position is perpendicular, if that which moves cannot bend, it will either fall forward as the right angle becomes acute, or will not be able to progress. For if one leg is at right angles to the ground, and the other is advanced, the latter will be at once equal and greater. For it will be equal to the stationary leg, and also equivalent to the hypotenuse of a right-angled triangle. That which goes forward therefore must bend, and while bending one, extend the other leg simultaneously, so as to incline forward and make a stride, and still remain above the perpendicular. For the legs form an isosceles triangle, and the head sinks lower when it is perpendicularly above the base on which it stands. Of limbless animals, some progress by undulations, and this happens in two ways. Either they undulate on the ground like snakes, or up and down like caterpillars, and undulation is a flexion. Others by a telescopic action, like what are called earthworms and leeches. These go forward, first one part leading, and then drawing the whole of the rest of the body up to this, and so they change from place to place. It is plain too that if the two curves were not greater than the one line which subtends them, undulating animals could not move themselves. When the flexure is extended, they would not have moved forward at all, if the flexure or arc were equal to the cord subtended. As it is, it reaches further when it is straightened out, and then this part stays still, and it draws up what is left behind. In all the changes described, that which moves now extends itself in a straight line to progress, and now is hooped. It straightens itself in its leading part, and is hooped in what follows behind. Even jumping animals all make a flexion in the part of the body which is underneath, and after this fashion make their leaps. So too flying and swimming things progress, the one straightening and bending their wings to fly, the other their fins to swim. Of the latter, some have 4 fins, others which are rather long, for example eels, have only 2. These swim by substituting a flexion of the rest of their body for the missing pair of fins to complete the movement, as we have said before. Flatfish use 2 fins, and the flat of their body as a substitute for the absent pair of fins. Quite flat fish, like the ray, produce their swimming movement with the actual fins, and with the 2 extremes or semicircles of their body bending and straightening themselves alternately. End of chapter 9. Chapters 10 to 13 of Progression of Animals by Aristotle, translated by A.S.L. Farquharson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 10. A difficulty might perhaps be raised about birds. How, it may be said, can they, either when they fly or when they walk, be said to move at 4 points? Now, we did not say that all sanguinea move at 4 points, but merely at not more than 4. Moreover, they cannot, as a fact, fly if their legs be removed, nor walk without their wings. Even a man does not walk without moving his shoulders. Everything, indeed, as we have said, makes a change of place by flexion and straightening, for all things progress by pressing upon what, being beneath them up to a point, gives way, as it were, gradually. Accordingly, even if there be no flexion in another member, there must be at least in the point whence motion begins, that is, in feathered flying insects at the base of the scale wing, in birds at the base of the wing, in others at the base of the corresponding member, the fins, for instance, in fishes. In others, for example snakes, the flexion begins in the joints of the body. In winged creatures the tail serves, like a ship's rudder, to keep the flying thing in its course. The tail, then, must, like other limbs, be able to bend at the point of attachment. And so flying insects and birds, Schizoptera, whose tails are ill-adapted for the use in question, for example peacocks and domestic cocks, and generally birds that hardly fly, cannot steer a straight course. Flying insects have absolutely no tail, and so drift along like a rudderless vessel, and beat against anything they happen upon. And this applies equally to sharded insects, like the scarab beetle and the chafer, and to unsharded, like bees and wasps. Further, birds that are not made for flight have a tail that is of no use, for instance the purple coot and the heron and all water fowl. These fly, stretching out their feet as a substitute for a tail, and use their legs instead of a tail to direct their flight. The flight of insects is slow and frail because the character of their feathery wings is not proportionate to the bulk of their body. This is heavy, their wings small and frail, and so the flight they use is like a cargo boat attempting to make its voyage with oars. Now, the frailty, both of the actual wings and of the outgrowths upon them, contributes in a measure to the flight described. Among birds, the peacock's tail is at one time useless because of its size, at another because it is shed. But birds are in general at the opposite pole to flying insects as regards their feathers, but especially the swiftest flyers among them. These are the birds with curved talons, for swiftness of wing is useful to their mode of life. The rest of their bodily structure is in harmony with their peculiar movement. The small head, the slight neck, the strong and acute breastbone, acute like the prow of a clipper-built vessel, so as to be well girt, and strong by dint of its mass of flesh, in order to be able to push away the air that beats against it, and that easily and without exhaustion. The hind quarters, too, are light and taper again, in order to conform to the movement of the front, and not by their breadth to suck the air. 11. So much then for these questions. But why an animal that is to stand erect must necessarily be not only a biped, but must also have the superior parts of the body lighter, and those that lie under these heavier, is plain. Only if situated like this could it possibly carry itself easily. And so man, the only erect animal, has legs longer and stouter relatively to the upper parts of his body than any other animal with legs. What we observe in children also is evidence of this. Children cannot walk erect because they are always dwarf-like, the upper parts of their bodies being longer and stouter than the lower. With advancing years, the lower increase disproportionately until the children get their appropriate size, and then, and not till then, they succeed in walking erect. Birds are hunchbacked, yet stand on two legs, because their weight is set back, after the principle of horses fashioned in bronze with their forelegs prancing. But their being bipeds and able to stand is above all due to their having the hip bone shaped like a thigh, and so large that it looks as if they had two thighs, one in the leg before the knee joint, the other joining this part to the fundament. Really, this is not a thigh but a hip, and if it were not so large, the bird could not be a biped. As in a man or a quadruped, the thigh and the rest of the leg would be attached immediately to quite a small hip. Consequently, the whole body would be tilted forward. As it is, however, the hip is long and extends right along to the middle of the belly, so that the legs are attached at that point and carry as supports the whole frame. It is also evident from these considerations that a bird cannot possibly be erect in the sense in which man is. For, as it holds its body now, the wings are naturally useful to it. But if it were erect, they would be as useless as the wings of cupids we see in pictures. It must have been clear as soon as we spoke that the form of no human, nor any similar being, permits of wings, not only because it would, though sanguineous, be moved at more than 4 points, but also because to have wings would be useless to it when moving naturally. And nature makes nothing contrary to her own nature. 12. We have stated above that without flexion in the legs or shoulders and hips, no sanguineous animal with feet could progress, and that flexion is impossible except some point be at rest, and that men and birds, both bipeds, bend their legs in opposite directions, and further that quadrupeds bend theirs in opposite directions, and each pair in the opposite way to a man's limbs. For men bend their arms backwards, their legs forwards, quadrupeds their forelegs forwards, their back legs backwards, and in like manner also birds bend theirs. The reason is that nature's workmanship is never purposeless, as we said above, but everything for the best possible in the circumstances. Inasmuch, therefore, as all creatures which naturally have the power of changing position by the use of limbs must have one leg stationary with the weight of the body on it, and when they move forward, the leg which has the leading position must be unencumbered, and the progression continuing, the weight must shift and be taken off on this leading leg, it is evidently necessary for the back leg from being bent to become straight again, while the point of movement of the leg thrust forward and its lower part remain still, and so the legs must be jointed. And it is possible for this to take place, and at the same time for the animal to go forward, if the leading leg has its articulation forwards; impossible if it be backwards. For if it be forwards, the stretching out of the leg will be while the body is going forwards, but if the other way, while it is going backwards. And again, if the flexion were backwards, the placing of the foot would be made by two movements, and those contrary to one another, one that is backwards, and one forwards. For in the bending together of the limb, the lower end of the thigh would go backwards, and the shin would move the foot forwards away from the flexion; whereas with the flexion forwards, the progression described will be performed not with contrary motions, but with one forward motion. Now man, being a biped, and making his change of position in the natural way with his two legs, bends them forward for the reasons set forth, but his arms bend backwards reasonably enough. If they bent the opposite way, they would be useless for the work of the hands, and for taking food. But quadrupeds, which are also viviparous, necessarily bend their front legs forwards, for these lead off first when they move, and are also in the fore part of their body. The reason that they bend forward is the same as in the case of man, for in this respect they are like mankind. And so quadrupeds as well as men bend these legs forward in the manner described. Moreover, if the flexion is like this, they are enabled to lift their feet high. If they bent them in the opposite way, they would only lift them a little way from the ground, because the whole thigh and the joint from which the shin bone springs would lie under the belly, as the beast moved forward. If, however, the flexion of the hind legs were forwards, the lifting of these feet would be similar to that of the fore feet, for the hind legs, too, would in this case have only a little room for their lifting, inasmuch as both the thigh and the knee joint would fall under the position of the belly. But the flexion being backwards, as in fact it is, nothing comes in the way of their progression with this mode of moving the feet. Moreover, it is necessary, or at least better for their legs to bend thus when they are suckling their young, with a view to such ministrations. If the flexion were inwards, it would be difficult to keep their young under them and to shelter them. 13. Now, there are 4 modes of flexion, if we take the combinations in pairs. Fore and hind may bend either both backwards, as the figures marked A, or in the opposite way, both forwards, as in B, or in converse ways, and not in the same direction, as in C, where the fore bend forwards and the hind bend backwards, or as in D, the opposite way to C, where the convexities are turned towards one another, and the concavities outwards. Now, no biped or quadruped bends his limbs like the figures A or B, but the quadrupeds like C and like D, only the elephant among quadrupeds, and man if you consider his arms as well as his legs. For he bends his arms concavely and his legs convexly. In man too, the flexions of the limbs are always alternately opposite. For example, the elbow bends back, but the wrist of the hand forwards, and again the shoulder forwards. In like fashion, too, in the case of the legs, the hip backwards, the knee forwards, the ankle in the opposite way, backwards. And plainly the lower limbs are opposed in this respect to the upper, because the first joints are opposites, the shoulder bending forwards, the hip backwards, wherefore also the ankle bends backwards, and the wrist of the hand forwards. End of chapter 13. Chapters 14 to 19 of Progression of Animals by Aristotle, translated by A.S.L. Farquharson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 14. This is the way then the limbs bend, and for the reasons given. But the hind limbs move crisscross with the forelimbs. After the off fore, they move the near hind, then the near fore, and then the off hind. The reason is that A, if they moved the forelegs together and first, the animal would be wrenched, and the progression would be a stumbling forwards, with the hind parts as it were dragged after. Again, that would not be walking but jumping, and it is hard to make a continuous change of place, jumping all the time. Here is evidence of what I say. Even as it is, all horses that move in this way soon begin to refuse. For example, the horses in a religious procession. For these reasons, the forelimbs and the hind limbs move in this separate way. Again, B. If they moved both the right legs first, the weight would be outside the supporting limbs, and they would fall. If then it is necessary to move in one or other of these ways, or crisscross fashion, and neither of these two is satisfactory, they must move crisscross. For moving in the way we have said, they cannot possibly experience either of these untoward results. And this is why horses and such like animals stand still with their legs put forward crisscross, not with the right or the left put forward together at once. In the same fashion, animals with more than four legs make their movements. If you take two consecutive pairs of legs, the hind move crisscross with the forelegs. You can see this if you watch them moving slowly. Even crabs move in this way, and they are polypods. They, too, always move crisscross in whichever direction they are making progress. For in direction, this animal has a movement all its own. It is the only animal that moves not forwards, but obliquely. Yet, since forwards is a distinction relative to the line of vision, nature has made its eyes able to conform to its limbs, for its eyes can move themselves obliquely, and therefore, after a fashion, crabs are no exception, but in this sense move forwards. 15. Birds bend their legs in the same way as quadrupeds, for their natural construction is, broadly speaking, nearly the same. That is, in birds, the wings are a substitute for the forelegs, and so they are bent in the same way as the forelegs of a quadruped, since when they move to progress the natural beginning of change is from the wings, as in quadrupeds from the forelegs. Flight, in fact, is their appropriate movement. And so, if the wings be cut off, a bird can neither stand still nor go forwards. Again, the bird, though a biped, is not erect, and has the forward parts of the body lighter than the hind, and so it is necessary, or at least preferable, for the standing posture to have the thigh so placed below the body as it actually is, I mean growing towards the back. If then it must have this situation, the flexion of the leg must be backwards, as in the hind legs of quadrupeds. The reasons are the same as those given in the case of viviparous quadrupeds. If now we survey generally birds and winged insects, and animals which swim in a watery medium, all, I mean, that make their progress in water by dint of organs of movement, it is not difficult to see that it is better to have the attachment of the parts in question oblique to the frame, exactly as, in fact, we see it to be both in birds and insects. And this same arrangement obtains also among fishes. Among birds, the wings are attached obliquely. So are the fins in water animals, and the feather-like wings of insects. In this way, they divide the air or water most quickly, and with most force, and so affect their movement. For the hinder parts in this way would follow forwards as they are carried along in the yielding medium, fish in the water, birds in the air. Of oviparous quadrupeds, all those that live in holes, like crocodiles, lizards, spotted lizards, freshwater tortoises, and turtles, have their legs attached obliquely, as their whole body sprawls over the ground, and bend them obliquely. The reason is that this is useful for ease in creeping into holes, and for sitting upon their eggs and guarding them. And as they are splayed outwards, they must of necessity tuck in their thighs and put them under them in order to achieve the lifting of the whole body. In view of this, they cannot bend them otherwise than outwards. 16. We have already stated the fact that non-sanguineous animals with limbs are polypods, and none of them quadrupeds. And the reason why their legs, except the extreme pairs, were necessarily attached obliquely, and had their flexions upwards, and the legs themselves were somewhat turned under, bandy-shaped, and backwards, is plain. In all such creatures the intermediate legs both lead and follow. If then they lay under them, they must have had their flexion both forwards and backwards on account of leading forwards, and on account of following backwards. Now, since they have to do both, for this reason their limbs are turned under and bent obliquely, except the two extreme pairs. These two are more natural in their movement, the front leading and the back following. Another reason for this kind of flexion is the number of their legs. Arranged in this way, they would interfere less with one another in progression and not knock together. But the reason that they are bandy is that all of them or most of them live in holes, for creatures living so cannot possibly be high above the ground. But crabs are in nature the oddest of all polypods. They do not progress forwards, except in the sense explained above, and they are the only animals which have more than one pair of leading limbs. The explanation of this is the hardness of their limbs, and the fact that they use them not for swimming but for walking. They always keep on the ground. However, the flexion of the limbs of all polypods is oblique, like that of the quadrupeds, which live in holes, for example, lizards and crocodiles, and most of the oviparous quadrupeds. And the explanation is that some of them in their breeding periods, and some all their life, live in holes. 17. Now the rest have bandy legs, because they are soft-skinned. But the crayfish is hard-skinned, and its limbs are for swimming, and not for walking, and so are not bandy. Crabs, too, have their limbs bent obliquely, but not bandy like oviparous quadrupeds, and not sanguineous polypods, because their limbs have a hard and shell-like skin, although they don't swim, but live in holes. They live in fact on the ground. Moreover, their shape is like a disc, as compared with the crayfish, which is elongated, and they haven't a tail like the crayfish. A tail is useful to the crayfish for swimming, but the crab is not a swimming creature. Further, it alone has its side equivalent to a hinder part, because it has many leading feet. The explanation of this is that its flexions are not forward, nor its legs turned in under bandy. We have given above the reason why its legs are not turned in under, that is, the hardness and shell-like character of its integument. For these reasons, then, it must lead off with more than one limb, and move obliquely. Obliquely, because the flexion is oblique, and with more than one limb, because otherwise the limbs that were still would have got in the way of those that were moving. Fishes of the flat kind swim with their heads twisted, as one-eyed men walk. They have their natural shape distorted. Web-footed birds swim with their feet, because they breathe the air and have lungs. They are bipeds. But because they have their home in the water, they are webbed. By this arrangement, their feet serve them instead of fins. They have their legs too, not like the rest of birds, in the center of their body, but rather set back. Their legs are short, and being set back are serviceable for swimming. The reason for their having short legs is that nature has added to their feet by subtracting from the length of their limbs. Instead of length, she gives stoutness to the legs and breadth to the feet. Broad feet are more useful than long for pushing away the water when they are swimming. 18. There is reason too for winged creatures having feet, but fish none. The former have their home in the dry medium, and cannot remain always in mid-air. They must therefore have feet. Fish, on the contrary, live in the wet medium, and take in water, not air. Fins are useful for swimming, but feet not. And if they had both, they would be non-sanguineous. There is a broad similarity between birds and fishes in the organs of locomotion. Birds have their wings on the superior part. Similarly, fish have two pectoral fins. Again, birds have legs on their underparts and near the wings. Similarly, most fish have two fins on the underparts and near the pectorals. Birds, too, have a tail, and fish a tail fin. 19. A difficulty may be suggested as to the movements of mollusks, that is, as to where that movement originates, for they have no distinction of left and right. Now, observation shows them moving. We must, I think, treat all this class as mutilated, and as moving in the way in which limbed creatures do when one cuts off their legs, or as analogous with the seal and the bat. Both the latter are quadrupeds, but misshapen. Now, mollusks do move, but move in a manner contrary to nature. They are not moving things, but are moving if as sedentary creatures they are compared with zoophytes, and sedentary if classed with progressing animals. As to the right and left, crabs too show the distinction poorly, still they do show it. You can see it in the claw. The right claw is larger and stronger, as though the right and left sides were trying to get distinguished. End of chapter 19, and end of Movement and Progression of Animals by Aristotle. Translated by A.S.L. Farquharson. Meta-coordinating and proof listening by David Craig. Read by Geoffrey Edwards, in memory of my wife Kahyen Edwards, who said, "Beauty of nature, simple joys of life."